Yes, so for the first question, I would like to ask why there is a debate about who can define beauty or...
Well, I think there's a large debate for a few reasons. One, we have in the last 100 years a major change in how beauty was viewed. Before 100 years ago, if you look at art, art had a pretty standard way of what beauty was. Most artists, when they were painting a painting, believed beauty was rooted in things like realism, idealism, this idea of this idealistic, portrait. And there really wasn't there was always debates over beauty, but more or less there was kind of a common consensus. But then, in the turn of the 20th century, you start seeing artists revolt against that and start saying, all of our preconceived notions of what beauty is are wrong. Beauty is subjective. It's much like morality. It's heavily connected to, for example, after World War I, people saw the horror in everything and said, how can there be such a thing as, morality? And so they started questioning all the previous old orders. And one of those old orders that I think was questioned was this notion of what beauty is. And I think that debate has continued into the present time because while most of the art world has embraced this new kind of subjective idea of beauty is whatever we make it, as the phrase beauty is in the eye of the beholder, who's to say what beautiful is? People face the reality though is when they go into a modern art museum, the art that's there in many ways has become quite a joke. One of the most famous pieces recently was a banana duct taped to a wall. And, we have that and then we compare it to the Mona Lisa. And we say, are we really talking about the same thing here? And so I think this ongoing debate is actually a really debate over the legitimacy of modern art. And modern art rests on the idea that beauty is subjective. So if I say, I don't get this modern art, I think it's ridiculous, a 3-year-old could do this, what's their response? Is, well, but to me it's beautiful. As an artist, I see beauty in this. And so I think there's a debate over this, in a sense, over the legitimacy of modern aesthetics, which is rooted on the idea that art is subjective. We can't criticize it. It's the same with architecture, with a lot of modernist architecture. If I were to, point out, Mole Tower or something, and I think a lot of most Hungarians, if you ask them Mole Tower, they would say, no, that's not the prettiest building. Yet someone designed that and wrote about how great it was. And that's a similar discussion there about, what is a beautiful building, And I think while most people actually have a general standard of what beauty is, a lot of people who actually run the art world, whether it's artists or architects, actually really believe in this ultimately subjective view of beauty, that beauty is what we make of it, And so I think that's why there's this larger debate going on.
In the ancient times, the philosophers were saying, or maybe I'm wrong, but as I remember, it was written that like the body or the face should be symmetric.
Yeah, and that's where I think you get into what are the general standards of beauty. And that's where it's like, really that's a question of what do humans like? And humans actually like themselves, as in the humans like the human body, human proportionality. If we think of columns, right? Columns are such the centerpiece of classical architecture. What does the column actually symbolize? The body, we even name it like that. We have the base of the column, the feet, the body, the capital. Capital means head, And so you're absolutely right. And symmetry is a key function of what we generally identify as beauty. And they've even done studies where they've taken infants and shown them disfigured faces. And infants actually have an instinctual revulsion against that. They recognize that this is not normal, And so when we talk about things like art and certain, I think, general standards, symmetry is a clear example, especially if we talk about architecture. We like buildings to be symmetrical. When a building is blatantly asymmetrical, we find that odd, even if we don't notice it. I think there's an instinctual revulsion against asymmetrical architecture or disproportionate architecture as well.
Maybe you have seen the movie The English Patient.
I have not, but I know of it.
Yeah, so when first I have seen that, the representative of Tunisia came to the theater and he said that the beautiful Tunisian landscape, which is basically the desert. So for him, that was beautiful. But if you ask me or other people, then we would say that's just sand.
Well, I think there definitely is a cultural interplay, and I don't want to say that every single human, if you ask them to paint a beautiful house, is going to paint the same thing, is going to come up with the same idea. There's vast cultural differences, but I do think that overall you do see some standards. For example, why do they see the Tunisian desert as beautiful? Because that's home to them, and home is a beautiful thing. And so I actually think that speaks to the general standard of we find what's familiar, what's homely, what connects us to our past is something that's beautiful. In the same way that, you probably would find your hometown more beautiful than someone who's not from your hometown because you have those memories connected with it. And so that's where I think the standard comes in. But I think even, I mostly talk about architecture. And I think, for example, Arabic architecture is vastly different from Western architecture. But actually there's some basic similarities. If you look at traditional Arabic architecture, it's symmetrical. It has design, it has ornamentation, it has something that I think even if we would say, okay, I don't want Debrecen to look like, this historic Arabic town, I do think we would say it's beautiful, in the sense that we can judge it as beautiful. And I think that's the key, is to call something beautiful doesn't necessarily mean I personally like it. You're simply recognizing that it has this character of beauty. Like I said, the same thing, I think the Taj Mahal is very beautiful. Would I want them to build the Taj Mahal in Budapest? No, it would be completely out of place. It has no permeance, but I would still say it's a beautiful building. And so I think by calling, that's part of the issue, is we've turned beauty into meaning, I like that. And I actually think you can hate something, but still think of it as a beautiful thing, and still recognize that there's beauty in that. And so I think even beauty is something that does transcend cultures, but it reveals itself in different ways in different cultures. But generally in all cultural architecture, you find things like symmetry, ornamentation, proportionality. Even if you go to, traditional Japanese architecture, it's symmetrical, it's ornamented, it reveals itself in different ways. But there's this basic human love of these distinct principles that was constant until 100 years ago, where we had the modernist aesthetic revolution, which said, no, we're getting away with all of this. No more symmetry, no more ornamentation, no more, in my opinion, no more beauty. We view concrete as beauty, and I think the Aranya Bika that we're in is a perfect example of that, where you have two diametrically opposed wings. And I think nothing better exemplifies the aesthetic revolution. And the idea that we could say that, well, depending on who you ask, both of these wings are beautiful. I think that's insane. I think 99% of people looking at this building, if I ask them which is the beautiful wing, or I said meet me at the beautiful wing, I think 99.999% of people would meet me at the historic wing and not in the communist bloc wing,
And what about music?
Yeah, music is of course another very interesting talk, and I think that's actually one of the most fascinating debates to have, because whereas, for example, architecture or art, there's not necessarily mass consumption of it. The average person doesn't buy architecture. If they design a house, maybe. The average person doesn't buy a masterpiece. But with music, we do see music's change, but we do see that, for example, music is still popular. It's not like everyone's listening to classical music and no one listens to this ugly modernist. And so I think that's where there's more of a discussion to be had. And that's why I would say modern music does exhibit less beauty than previous music, but it does exhibit other values. And that's the point where beauty is not the only aesthetic value. We could argue whether or not it's the best aesthetic value, but there are other things. There are other emotions that can be conveyed in things other than beauty. And I think, for example, if you look at rap music, I don't think rap music is beautiful, but that's not to say that there's not something aesthetically attracting to it. It has a great sense of rhythm, a sense of beat, there's other aspects of it that attract us. And so with music, I think that's where it doesn't become necessarily a question. And I do think I would argue art has been quite deconstructed. Music is probably the least deconstructed aesthetic. Generally, you kind of still need to have a rhythm. You still need to have a beat. And so I think more of music still maintains basic human tastes, whereas some of the other aesthetic arts, like I think art, I would argue, has completely rejected basic human taste. And so, like I said, I think with music, that's more of a discussion. I think that's where there's more of a debate, of beauty. But I would argue that simply modern music exhibits things other than beauty, But I still think, that's not to say it's never without beauty, But I would say the musical area is probably the area that I'm least grounded in. I'm more with architecture rather than music. But based on what I've read, that's what my argument would be.
Thank you.
Yeah.